Star Wars Bounty Hunter first released 22 years ago in November of 2002. It's an action-adventure game where you play as Jango Fett, and it serves as a prequel to 2002's Star Wars Episode II Attack of the Clones. Not to be mistaken for merely the PlayStation 4 re-release we saw a while back that was literally an up-res, this version looks to improve everything from textures to lighting, performance, controls, and everything in between. So, specifically looking at the Nintendo Switch version, and do be warned, stick around to the section specifically about handheld mode, there'll be timestamps for everything, so you can go to exactly what you need to. But is this one more daftly insidious release, or is it dang going to be amazing? Oh, that was so bad. That was so bad. I apologise. Well, let's find out. First, let's take a quick look at the original release. As you can see, everything was very retro, as I like to call it, or old as my daughter does. Low resolution textures. What you can't see from the visuals is just how bad the controls are, with a very unusual control method indeed, and performance that didn't fare much better. There are no dynamic lights, no reflections, but it still managed to be quite a okay looking game for the time. Then we jump ahead to the PlayStation 4 re-release. As far as visual quality, you're looking at the same deal. However, this is now upscaled to a native resolution for the PS4, meaning that it just looked better. With that said though, it wasn't designed to stretch over to a wide screen, and as such, it still looks very dated. That brings us up to 2024 then with the Nintendo Switch release, and straight away you can see a huge jump in visual quality. Native resolutions, low aliasing, not many jaggy edges, and some nice additions like some dynamic lights casting real-time shadows beneath the player. On top of this, the textures have been improved across the board. But not only that, we also see some reflective qualities added to some of the models. Most notably, Jango Fett's helmet, which is now particularly shiny. In certain scenes, it actually looks very nice. Environmental geometry remains the same, and actually this stands out as one of the weaker aspects alongside some of the tertiary character models like those you see of the aliens wandering around here. They definitely are an improvement looking like this on Switch. And of course we have proper widescreen support. Now, unlike some of Night Dive Studios re-releases, although we do have some new lighting effects here, I don't think it's quite the same level of improvement across the board. The combination of the lighting textures and upscale mean that in some scenes it looks significantly better than it used to. I know geometry is generally the same, but bump maps can make some surfaces look significantly better than just a texture improvement. Before we go further, let's have a look at some of the control options, because those are the intangible that you can't see from these visuals. As mentioned, the original control scheme was horrible. Now that is still here, but you've also got the option for modern controls. It means that you can change the X-Y axis, and selecting modern controls will remap some of the buttons, which were unusual to say the least when the game first came out. It also features a tutorial for these new remapped controls, and it handles the way you would expect. The right moving the camera, the left to use the zoom function, clicking in the analog sticks to lock onto targets, and quickly switch by using the right one. If you played the game originally, you will know just how much of a difference having modern controls will make, and it really does. It's just easy to play now. But if for whatever reason you want to use those original ones, you can. Now you can change sensitivities, and I have to say I'm a bit disappointed they didn't add in gyroscopic controls. They've got the performance here, we've seen it done time and time again, but it's not in here, and that's a shame because you do have those sections where you're manually aiming, and it would have made the world a difference. Load times are much faster than they were before. If you fall to your death or die unexpectedly, well, you can expect to blink, and about 3 milliseconds later the game will have loaded back to where you were. It's really good to see actually, and is something that's often overlooked. I did briefly mention the improvements to aliasing. Now anti-aliasing is running well here. It means you don't see jaggy edges on the outside of objects, and I also didn't notice any pop-in or other items that weren't there in the original. but there are a couple of things that were. Sometimes when you're crouching down, your head will clip through the environment if you're going through a low tunnel. Also, although the camera has been vastly improved, clicking the right stick in locks onto the nearest enemy, except for when it doesn't, but it's also defaulting to locking the camera behind the player. What it means is you'll run around, click it in, and if there's no enemy just within range, or you're not looking the camera at them at the time, then it will move quickly behind you, and it just feels a bit clunky. I think they need to do a little bit of work there just to fix that, or at least make a toggle in the options so that it doesn't default to going behind the player. Next up comes the performance. Now it targets 60 frames per second, hallelujah, in docked mode, but in handheld, oh dear, it seems that Aspyr have struggled with the Nintendo Switch's variable clock speeds for both GPU and CPU, and for whatever reason, the game is running at 30 frames per second locked out when you're playing in handheld. That is a real shame if you're a handheld player. But we'll start with the 60 frames per second docked mode. This is generally 60 most of the time, and frame pacing tends to be below 32 milliseconds. For me, anything below 30, 32 is generally okay. Obviously you can see here there are some micro stutters taking place, but they're stuttering below 30, so my old man eyes can't really tell unless it's a very big stutter, usually when there are lots of enemies on the screen or when those old school particle effects kick in, the coding of which has always been a problem when brought to modern platforms. But this tends to hover around 55 to 60, never really going below 50, but not able to maintain 60 at all times, which realistically I think it should be able to, even with these few tweaks. Now, it's not the end of the world, it feels very responsive as long as you're in docked mode. Switch to handheld, and while it's still reasonable, this is the type of game, especially without gyroscope, that needs 60 or as close to 60 as you can get. The drop to 30 is very obvious, and I'm disappointed with that. And one other graphical option that they've included, which is interesting to me, because I'm a huge nerd, is Vsync. That stands for vertical synchronization. And what it means is the game is essentially trying to lock the refresh rate to the frame rate. It's trying to sync those two things up. It can mean that it can feel more smooth, but when you have something that's dropping below refresh rate, which in this case is 60 FPS, it can introduce some stutter and performance dips. So potentially, to preserve input latency, you might want to experiment with switching that off. There's always some latency introduced when you're trying to sync those two things up. Now again, I haven't actually felt that. I couldn't feel any latency at all, even in the moments where performance did dip ever so slightly. Something that hasn't seen an improvement in the animations. They are exactly as they were when the game first came out, for better and sometimes worse, but the higher frame rate facilitates a more pleasant experience in most regards, particularly when you're fighting enemies. If you've got yourself a nice set of headphones, then we can take a little listen to the sound quality differences, because articulating those is never easy. Here's the sound of the original game. That takes us on to the price and download size. If you were lucky enough to pick this up early, you would have seen it had a 10% discount that took it down to £16.19. But the RRP of £17.99 isn't terrible actually, let's be honest. On a Nintendo handheld, any re-release of a Nintendo game comes out at a hefty price tag, and sometimes with no more improvements than we've got here. And as for space, it's going to take up 9.6 gigs on either your external or internal memory. As of today, Aspyr have given us no news about a physical release. I should imagine, as is often the case, it really depends on the number of sales and demand, but it is worth mentioning that the PlayStation release back in 2019 did actually feature a limited, I believe, physical release. So it gives me some hope that we might see that. Now I thought I'd include just some information about other things that we may or may not see on the Switch version, or in this case, well, we're not going to see them. The PlayStation 4 version obviously features support for the adaptive triggers, but it also features the health bar integration into its light bar, voice communicate if you have multiple platforms. Finally then, on this version we have some potential Easter egg content. Back in 2002, you could find this low resolution texture with the message that read "cash in all bounties to play as Boba." But when you did that, well, you didn't get the Boba Fett skin. But Aspyr has seen fit to bake that back into this version, so you can now unlock and play as Boba Fett after completing the campaign. Happy days. When it comes to gameplay, the whole thing does feel dated. This features a number of unique mechanics, such as the bounty system, whereby you can scan for bounties and then take those in either dead or alive. This will mean shocking them and then rather jankily approaching and pressing a button where they disappear to hand the bounty in, or just shooting them dead on the spot. If you kill your bounty before you've actually scanned them, then you won't get your reward. The environments, they are a little dated as well, but for its time it had surprisingly good verticality, particularly once you'd unlock the jetpack. This allows you to either hover for a short time or move up to a higher height and grab on ledges. It turns some levels back on themselves, often making you move vertically to progress, and it's actually still a lot of fun today. Combat generally involves locking onto enemies, strafing around and rolling, and just holding the fire button down, which, as again I said before, with the new controls is much easier. Despite becoming a little repetitive and not offering a huge amount of challenge, credit has to be given to how authentic a Star Wars experience this is. We live in a post-Mandalorian world where everyone knows all the little gadgets and devices that a bounty hunter can have, but having the option to switch between your fists, pistols, different weapons that you pick up, your gadgets, as well as your trusty jetpack, it switches things up a little, but let's be honest, it's showing its age in most areas, and for many, not having 60 frames per second in handheld is going to be a no-go. So there we have it, an interesting release from Aspyr, this one. Not bad, just interesting, and we really need 60 FPS in handheld. You can't tell me that it can't run it, surely. Cheers to our Patreons, our members, all of you that enjoy the content, and as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!